When conducting a case control study, we use an odds ratio as the measure of association. This particular measure, the way it's calculated, is it's basically just a fraction. It's a fraction of the odds of exposure among cases compared to the odds of exposure among controls. This is what we call an indirect measure of association, meaning that we can't directly measure risk. When you think about something like a relative risk, that would be considered a direct measure of association. You're calculating the incidence rates in your exposed versus your unexposed group. However, in a case control study, you cannot measure incidence because to calculate incidence, you have to be able to tell the number of people who have developed the disease, the number of new cases during a period of time. So that's something we can calculate in, like, for example, a cohort study. However, a case control study is very different in the sense that we are going out and we are recruiting people who have a particular health outcome, and then we are recruiting a control group that does not have that particular health outcome, and we are comparing those two. So we can't actually observe any kind of incidence or calculate any kind of incidence rate in a case control study. Therefore, we have to use an odds ratio. To calculate an odds ratio, we set up a 2x2 table. Our exposure status is always going to go on this side, and our disease status is always going to go on the top. And you'll see that the people who are exposed go here, the people who are not exposed are here, and then the cases are here and the controls are here. So to calculate an odds ratio, you can just memorize this formula here. However, I highly advise not doing that. You want to calculate these numbers in a way that you know exactly what you're doing. So remember, we are comparing cases to controls. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare the odds of exposure in cases to the odds of exposure in controls. To calculate the odds of exposure, you're taking the people who are exposed and you're dividing that by the people who are not exposed. So if we start doing this for our cases, it's going to be this A divided by C. That's the odds of exposure in our cases. And then separately, we can calculate the odds of exposure in our controls by taking this B divided by D. So you've got those two fractions. Now to calculate your odds ratio, all you're going to do is divide these two. So you'll take this odds of exposure in cases, this A over C, and you're going to divide that by the odds of exposure in the controls, which is then B over D. You get this equation here, which then translates into this fraction here. So let's plug in some numbers and do this as an example. So if I were to do this, I could either memorize that formula or I could actually go through and plug in the numbers so I know exactly what I'm doing. So if I was going to calculate this odds ratio, what I would do is I would take the odds of exposure in my cases first. If I were to do that, it would be this 9 over 95. And then I would divide that by the odds of exposure in my controls, which would then be this 4 over 88. When you actually calculate those numbers, you end up with an odds ratio of 2.08. So that's how you calculate an odds ratio.